I need a wife, and you need strong sons. The words didn't just echo, they froze the entire ballroom, and Claire Bennett felt every eye turn toward her like she had just stepped into a spotlight she never asked for, her breath catching as she stood there in a borrowed uniform that didn't quite fit, her worn sneakers hidden beneath a long black skirt, her hands still trembling from carrying trays all night, because just minutes ago she had been invisible. Another tired waitress trying to make it through a double shift for barely enough tips to cover rent, and now the most powerful man in the room, the one they whispered about in hushed voices, the one no one dared look at directly, was staring at her like she was the only thing that existed, his presence filling the air with a quiet, crushing weight that made even the chandeliers seem to dim, and Claire didn't understand why, didn't understand how someone like him, tall, impossibly composed, with pale skin that seemed untouched by warmth and eyes that held something ancient and unreadable, could possibly be speaking to someone like her, because she knew her place, she always had, a girl who worked too many hours, who ate dinner from a paper bag in a back hallway, who learned early that kindness was the only thing she could afford to give, and yet when he had walked into the ballroom earlier, the entire world had shifted without warning, conversations had died mid-sentence, glasses had stilled in midair, and Claire had felt it too, that strange drop in temperature, that quiet command that didn't need to be spoken, and she had kept her head down like she was trained to do, focusing on not spilling anything, not drawing attention, not making mistakes, because mistakes meant losing this job, and losing this job meant losing everything. But then there had been that moment, small and almost nothing, when she stepped into a side hallway to catch her breath and found him there, alone, standing still like a statue carved from shadow, and instead of fear, something else had risen in her chest, something softer, something human, because for just a second he didn't look like a king, he looked tired, and without thinking, without understanding why, she had reached out and straightened the cuff of his sleeve where it had folded wrong, a simple gesture, the kind her mother used to do, and she had whispered, barely audible, "You look like you haven't rested in days," and then she had stepped back, heart racing, expecting anger, expecting cold dismissal, but he hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just watched her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter, and now, standing in the center of the ballroom with his words still hanging in the air, Claire realized that moment had changed something, something she couldn't take back, because the nobles around her were already reacting, whispers rising like a storm, disbelief, outrage, curiosity, all crashing together, but she couldn't hear any of it clearly, not over the sound of her own heartbeat, not over the weight of his gaze still locked onto hers, steady, unyielding, as if he had already decided something that no one else could change, and for the first time in her life, Claire Bennett understood what it felt like to stand at the edge of something vast and irreversible, something that would pull her out of the small, fragile life she had built and into a world she had never imagined, and as the silence stretched just a second too long, she realized with a sudden, quiet certainty that whatever came next, there was no stepping back. No one moved, not even the servers holding silver trays that suddenly felt too heavy to carry, and Claire became painfully aware of how small she was in that vast room, how out of place she looked among tailored suits and gowns that probably cost more than her entire year of rent, yet the silence did not break until a sharp voice cut through it, a noblewoman stepping forward with a smile that did not reach her eyes, questioning the choice without ever daring to say it directly, but Claire could feel the meaning behind every word, could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders, and for a second she almost stepped back, almost apologized for existing in a place she clearly did not belong, but then she felt it again, that presence beside her, not touching, not even moving, yet unmistakably there, like standing next to a storm that had chosen not to strike, and when she glanced up, she saw that his gaze had not shifted even once, still fixed on her with that same calm certainty, as if the entire room, every voice, every protest, meant nothing compared to whatever decision he had already made, and something inside her steadied, not confidence, not courage exactly, but a quiet refusal to shrink any further, because she had spent her entire life stepping back, making herself smaller so others could feel bigger, and she was suddenly very tired of it, so when the noblewoman's voice sharpened and the whispers grew louder, Claire did not look away, did not lower her head, she simply stood there, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the only thing she could control, and that was enough, because the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a current changing direction, and the man beside her finally moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just one step forward, yet the effect rippled through the room, conversations dying before they could even begin, and Claire felt the air tighten again, heavier now, more deliberate, as if every person present understood that whatever happened next would not be open for debate. And then his voice came, quieter this time, but somehow more powerful than before, not raised, not forced, simply absolute, and the noblewoman fell silent without being told, the rest of the crowd following instinctively, because power like that did not need to prove itself, it simply existed, and Claire realized with a strange clarity that this was the moment everything would shift, not just for her, but for every person watching, because choices made at this level did not stay contained, they spread, they changed alliances, expectations, futures, and she was now standing at the center of it without any preparation, without any warning, and the thought should have terrified her, it probably did somewhere deep down, but what she felt most in that moment was something quieter, something almost surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Except it was her name that would be whispered after tonight, her face that would be remembered, and when he finally extended his hand, not as a command but as an invitation that carried the weight of inevitability, Claire hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough to understand what she was about to give up, the small, fragile normal life she had fought so hard to hold on to, the anonymity that had once felt like safety, and then she placed her hand in his, and the moment their skin met, the world did not explode, nothing dramatic happened, but something shifted in a way she could not explain, a quiet pull, like a thread tightening between them, subtle yet undeniable, and she knew without anyone needing to tell her that this was only the beginning, because as the room finally exhaled and movement returned in cautious waves, the way people looked at her had already changed, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, but something far more complicated, a mix of curiosity, calculation, and something that felt dangerously close to fear, and standing there with her hand still in his, Claire Bennett realized she had just stepped into a world where nothing would ever be simple again. The moment her hand settled in his, Claire felt the shift ripple outward, subtle yet unstoppable, like a stone dropped into still water, and the crowd did not need to be told what it meant, because their reactions sharpened instantly, conversations lowering into controlled murmurs, eyes narrowing with new intent, and Claire realized that whatever protection his presence offered, it also placed her directly in the path of something far more complex than she had ever known, because this was no longer about a strange declaration in a ballroom, this was about power, lineage, expectation, and she could feel it in the way the staff no longer moved around her as if she were invisible, instead stepping carefully, respectfully, almost cautiously, as if one wrong move near her might carry consequences, and that thought alone made her chest tighten, because she had never been someone others needed to be careful around. She had always been the one adjusting, apologizing, accommodating, and now the balance had flipped so quickly it made her dizzy, but before she could even process it fully, he began to walk, not pulling her, not forcing her, yet the direction was clear, and her feet followed almost instinctively, each step across the polished marble floor echoing louder than it should, as if marking the end of something and the beginning of something else entirely, and the crowd parted without hesitation, creating a path that felt less like an honor and more like a boundary being drawn, separating her from everything she had known just an hour ago, and she tried to steady her breathing, tried to focus on something simple, like the rhythm of her steps or the faint scent of polished wood and candlelight in the air, but it was impossible to ignore the awareness that every movement was being watched, measured, remembered, and when they reached the far end of the ballroom where tall glass doors opened to a quieter corridor, the noise behind them faded almost instantly, replaced by a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, and for the first time since this began, Claire allowed herself to glance at him properly, not just a quick look, but a real one, taking in the details she had not dared study before, the precise way he carried himself, the absence of any unnecessary motion, the quiet intensity that seemed to surround him like a second presence, and she realized that standing this close made everything feel sharper, clearer, as if the world itself adjusted around him, and yet there was something else there too, something she could not name, something that did not match the stories whispered about him, and it made her hesitate, just slightly, enough for him to notice, because he slowed, turning his head just enough for their eyes to meet again, and this time the distance was gone, no crowd, no noise, just that steady, unwavering gaze that felt less like scrutiny and more like recognition, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less certain, asking her a simple question that carried far more weight than it should, whether she understood what she had just agreed to. And Claire opened her mouth to answer, to say something honest, something grounded, but the truth caught in her throat, because she did not understand, not fully, not even close. She only understood that walking away was no longer an option, that whatever this was had already taken hold, and instead of pretending otherwise, she gave the only answer she could, a quiet admission that she did not know, and for a brief second, something shifted in his expression. So slight most people would have missed it, but Claire did not, because she had spent her life reading small changes in people just to stay safe, and what she saw was not disappointment, not frustration, but something closer to approval, as if honesty mattered more than certainty, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant this was not a mistake, not a random choice made in a moment. It meant he had seen something in her that she had not yet seen in herself, and as the corridor stretched ahead into shadow and quiet, Claire Bennet understood that whatever reason had brought her here, she was about to find out exactly how much her life was about to change. The corridor seemed to stretch longer than it should, each step carrying Claire further away from everything familiar, and the silence that followed them was not empty but intentional, as if even sound itself respected the space around him, and she became acutely aware of the faint echo of her own footsteps, too loud, too human, a reminder that she did not belong here, not in this quiet world of polished stone and controlled stillness. And yet he did not release her hand, did not tighten his grip either, simply held it with a steadiness that felt less like possession and more like certainty, and that unsettled her in a different way, because certainty was something she had never been allowed to have, not in her life of shifting schedules and uncertain paychecks, not in the constant calculation of how many hours she needed to work just to keep going, and now here she was, walking beside someone who moved as if nothing in the world could challenge his decisions, and it made her wonder, not for the first time, why her, why now, what could he possibly gain from choosing someone with nothing to offer but quiet resilience, and as that thought settled, the corridor opened into a private chamber, the space dimly lit with soft amber light that reflected off dark wood and glass, elegant without being overwhelming, controlled in a way that made everything feel deliberate, and he finally let go of her hand. Not abruptly, not dismissively, just enough to give her space, and for a second Claire did not move, unsure whether to stand, to speak, or to leave, because every instinct she had learned told her to wait, to read the room, to avoid doing the wrong thing, but this was not a room she understood, and before the uncertainty could take over, his voice broke the silence again, calm, measured, asking her something unexpected, not about obedience, not about acceptance, but about her life, where she had come from, how long she had been working, and the questions caught her off guard because they were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried a weight she could not explain, as if the answers mattered more than they should, and for a moment she hesitated, unsure how much to say, because her life was not impressive, not remarkable, just long shifts, overdue bills, and the quiet habit of enduring whatever came her way, but when she looked at him, really looked, she realized he was waiting, not impatiently, not with expectation of perfection, just waiting, and that alone was enough to make her answer honestly, her voice steady even as her hands remained still at her sides, explaining the routine she had built, the hours she worked, the small things she held on to get through each day, and as she spoke, she noticed something shift again, not in the room, not in the air, but in him, subtle but real, his attention sharpening, not in the way of someone judging, but in the way of someone recognizing something they had been searching for, and when she finished, the silence that followed felt different, not heavy, not tense, but thoughtful, and Claire found herself holding her breath without realizing it, waiting for whatever would come next, because this moment, quiet as it was, felt just as important as the one in the ballroom, and when he finally spoke again, his words were slower, more deliberate, explaining that what he had offered was not a passing statement, not something that could be ignored or undone, that from this point forward, her life would no longer belong only to her, that it would be tied to something older, something larger than either of them, and Claire felt that truth settle deep in her chest, not as fear, not exactly, but as a realization that the path ahead was already unfolding whether she understood it or not, and yet instead of stepping back, instead of asking to leave, she found herself standing still, grounded in the one thing that had always carried her through uncertainty, her ability to face what came next, even when she did not have all the answers. And as the quiet room held that moment between them, Claire Bennet understood that whatever this was, whatever reason had brought her into his world, she had just crossed a line she could never step back from. Claire did not realize how tightly she was holding on to herself. Until the silence stretched just a second longer than expected, her shoulders slowly lowering as she let out a breath she had not noticed she was keeping, and the room seemed to settle with her, the soft amber light reflecting faintly in the polished surfaces around them, creating a calm that felt almost unreal compared to the tension of the ballroom. Yet beneath that calm something else was forming, something she could not quite name, because his words had not been a threat, not a demand, but they had not been gentle either, they had been final, and Claire understood that kind of tone, not from power or authority, but from moments in life where decisions had already been made and all that remained was whether you could keep up with them, and she had spent years learning how to keep up, how to adapt, how to survive situations she never chose. But this felt different, because this was not something happening to her from the outside. This was something she had stepped into, even if she had not fully realized it at the time, and that thought settled heavily in her chest as she finally found her voice again, asking the one question she could not ignore, why her, and the words came out quieter than she intended, not weak, but careful, like she was testing the ground beneath her feet, and for a moment he did not answer, his gaze shifting slightly as if considering something far beyond the room they stood in. And when he spoke, it was not immediate, not rehearsed, but deliberate. Explaining that strength was not always visible, not always measured in the ways people expected, that sometimes it revealed itself in consistency, in endurance, in the ability to remain kind in a world that did not reward it, and Claire felt something tighten in her chest at that, because those were not qualities anyone had ever pointed out to her before, not as something valuable, not as something worth choosing. And yet here he was, speaking as if those quiet parts of her life had been seen, recognized, even valued, and it made her uneasy in a way she could not explain, because being overlooked had always been easier than being understood, and before she could respond, a soft knock broke the stillness, the door opening just enough for a figure to step inside, dressed with the same controlled precision as everything else in this place, their presence respectful yet alert, and Claire immediately felt the shift again, the reminder that whatever this moment was, it existed within a much larger structure, one that did not pause simply because she was trying to understand it, and the figure spoke quietly, informing him that preparations were already being discussed, that the council was requesting confirmation, and Claire caught the word council like a spark catching dry air, because it carried implications she did not fully grasp but instinctively understood to be significant, and when she looked back at him, she saw that same calm certainty return, not shaken, not questioned, simply acknowledged, and he gave a brief response that seemed to settle something beyond the walls of this room, and when the door closed again, the quiet returned. But it was no longer the same kind of quiet, it held movement now, consequences, and Claire realized that whatever decision had been made tonight was already spreading, already taking shape in ways she could not see, and for the first time since this began, the weight of it pressed more clearly against her thoughts, because this was not just about her life changing, this was about stepping into something that would not stop, not slow down, not adjust for her confusion, and yet as she stood there, she did not feel the urge to run, did not feel the instinct to retreat back into the small, controlled world she had known. Instead there was something else, something steady beneath the uncertainty, a quiet resolve that had carried her through every difficult day before this, and as she met his gaze again, she realized that whatever reason had brought her here, whatever path was unfolding in front of her, she was not going to step away from it, even if she did not yet understand where it would lead. The quiet did not last long, because once a decision like this was spoken into existence, it began to move on its own, and Claire could feel it now in the subtle changes around her, in the way the air seemed more alert, more watchful, as if unseen lines had been drawn and everyone beyond this room was already reacting to them, and she realized that whatever protection his presence gave her, it also placed her at the center of something far larger than a single moment or conversation, and that understanding settled into her thoughts just as he turned slightly, walking toward the far window where the city light stretched out below like a distant, unreachable world, and for a brief second Claire followed his gaze, recognizing the streets she had walked only hours ago, the small corners of a life that already felt like it belonged to someone else. And the contrast struck her harder than she expected. Because that world had been simple, difficult but understandable, every problem had a shape, a solution, a limit, but this world did not feel like that. It felt open, endless, and uncertain in a way that made her pulse quicken, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm certainty, explaining that what had begun tonight would not remain contained within these walls, that there were rules older than memory, expectations that could not be ignored, and that from this point forward, she would be seen, evaluated, and tested in ways she could not yet anticipate, and Claire felt a flicker of tension at that, not fear exactly, but awareness, because she understood what it meant to be tested. She had lived her entire life being measured by whether she worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, endured enough, but this felt different, because here the stakes were not survival in the usual sense. They were something deeper, something tied to identity, to purpose, to a role she had never imagined for herself, and she found herself asking another question, not out of defiance but out of a need to understand, what happens if she does not meet those expectations, and the room seemed to still slightly at that, the weight of the question hanging between them, and when he turned back to face her, his expression had not hardened, had not softened, it remained steady, but there was something else in his gaze now, something that suggested he had already considered that possibility. Long before she asked, and his answer came without hesitation, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple truth, that failure was not something he intended to allow, not for her, not for what she represented, and that whatever challenges came, she would not face them alone, and Claire felt that settle into her thoughts in a way she had not expected, because she had never been someone others stood beside, never been someone whose success or failure mattered beyond her own small world, and now that had changed, completely, irreversibly, and the realization brought with it a strange mix of pressure and something else, something steadier, almost grounding, because for the first time the path ahead, while uncertain, did not feel like something she had to navigate entirely on her own, and as she stood there, looking at him, at the quiet certainty that seemed to define every word he spoke, Claire Bennett began to understand that this was not just about being chosen, it was about being placed into a role that carried weight, expectation, and consequence, and whether she had asked for it or not, she was now part of it, and as the city lights flickered in the distance and the quiet room held that realization in place, she knew that whatever came next would not wait for her to be ready, it would come regardless, and the only choice she had left was whether she would meet it standing still or moving forward. They did not return to the ballroom, not immediately, and Claire realized that the distance between that room and this quiet space was more than just physical, it was a boundary, a separation between what the world had seen and what was actually unfolding beneath it, and she felt that difference settle into her awareness as he moved toward the door once more, not hurried, not hesitant, simply continuing forward as if everything had already been accounted for, and when he opened it, the corridor beyond was no longer empty. Figures now stood at a respectful distance, their posture straight, their attention sharp, and Claire could feel their focus shift the moment she stepped into view beside him, not openly, not disrespectfully, but unmistakably, and it was different from before, no longer curiosity alone, now there was calculation, recognition, and something else that made her instinctively straighten her shoulders, because she understood that these were not casual observers, these were people who measured outcomes, who understood consequences, and who would not forget what had been set into motion tonight, and as they began to walk again, the space seemed to respond, doors opening before they reached them, footsteps aligning in quiet coordination, and Claire realized that nothing here happened by accident, every movement was part of a structure she was only beginning to see, and the deeper they went, the more that structure revealed itself, not in grand displays, but in controlled precision, and it made her wonder how long it would take before she could understand even a fraction of it, if she ever could, and that thought lingered as they reached a set of doors larger than the others, their surface dark and smooth, reflecting the soft light in a way that made them feel almost impenetrable, and when they opened, the space beyond was not another quiet chamber, but something far more formal, a room arranged with intention, with seats positioned in careful symmetry, and figures already present, waiting, their attention turning as one when Claire stepped inside, and the shift was immediate, the atmosphere tightening, not with hostility, but with expectation, and Claire felt it settle against her like a weight she could not ignore, because this was no longer a private conversation, This was something else entirely, something official, something that would define what came next, and she could feel the difference in the way they looked at her, no longer just observing, but assessing, as if trying to understand what she was and what she might become, and for a moment the instinct to step back returned, quiet but persistent, the familiar urge to remove herself from situations where she did not belong. But it did not take hold, because she was already here. Already part of this, and stepping back now would not undo what had been set in motion, and as that realization steadied her, she remained where she was, her posture still, her expression calm, even as her thoughts moved quickly beneath the surface, and beside her, he did not pause, did not hesitate, simply took his place as if the room itself existed around him, and the silence that followed was different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but deliberate, waiting, and when one of the figures finally spoke, their voice measured and controlled, addressing him directly, referencing what had occurred earlier, seeking confirmation in a way that carried more weight than a simple question, and Claire understood that this was the moment where what had been declared would either be solidified or challenged, and she felt the tension of it in the air, subtle but undeniable, and when he answered, his voice did not rise, did not need to, it carried through the room with quiet authority, confirming what had already been said, leaving no space for doubt, and the effect was immediate, a shift in posture, a recalibration of attention, as if the room itself had adjusted to a new reality, and Claire stood there, feeling that change ripple outward once more, understanding now that this was no longer a possibility, not a question, but a decision that had been accepted into something far larger than either of them, and as the room settled into this new alignment, she realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by chance, it would be shaped by the structure she had just stepped into, and she was now part of it whether she fully understood it or not. The room did not erupt into chaos after his confirmation, it did something far more unsettling, it adapted, the tension shifting into a quieter, sharper form as the figures seated around the chamber exchanged brief glances that carried more meaning than any raised voice ever could, and Claire felt that shift immediately, like stepping onto ground that looked solid but moved beneath her feet, because now that the decision had been acknowledged, the focus was no longer on whether it would happen, but on what it meant, and she could see it in the way one of the elders leaned forward slightly, their expression composed but intent, asking a question that sounded simple on the surface yet carried layers she could not fully understand, a question about lineage, about continuity, about whether the choice aligned with laws that had existed long before she had ever been born. And Claire felt the weight of those words even if she did not grasp every detail, because she understood what it meant. To be measured against standards you did not create, expectations you did not ask for, and beside her, he did not react with impatience or irritation, he answered with the same steady clarity, acknowledging the rules without yielding to them, as if he recognized their importance but refused to let them define the outcome, and that balance was something Claire noticed immediately, because it was not defiance, not submission, it was control, the kind that came from knowing exactly where the boundaries were and deciding which ones mattered, and as the conversation continued, she began to pick up fragments, references to bloodlines, to stability, to something described only as a threshold that had not been crossed in generations, and while the words themselves were unfamiliar, the tone was not, it was the tone of people trying to predict consequences, trying to manage risk, and Claire realized that in their eyes she was not just a person, she was a variable, an unknown factor introduced into a system that had remained stable for a very long time, and that realization should have made her feel small, insignificant, but instead it did something else, it sharpened her awareness, because she had spent her entire life being underestimated, being dismissed as unimportant, and she had learned how to survive within that space, how to observe, how to understand more than people expected her to, and now those same instincts were rising again, steadying her in a way she had not anticipated, and when another voice entered the discussion, softer but no less firm, suggesting that choices like this often carried unintended consequences, Claire felt the attention in the room shift toward her more directly, not openly confrontational, but focused, as if waiting to see how she would respond to being spoken about rather than spoken to, and for a brief second the old instinct returned, to stay silent, to let others decide, but it did not hold, because something about this moment felt different, and before she could overthink it, she spoke, her voice calm. Not loud, but clear enough to carry, not challenging, not defensive, simply honest, acknowledging that she did not understand all the rules they followed, but that she understood what it meant to be held to expectations, and that if she was going to be part of this, she would not do it halfway, and the words settled into the room with a quiet impact that surprised even her, because the reaction was not immediate rejection, not dismissal, but something far more subtle, a pause, a reconsideration. As if the unknown variable had just revealed something unexpected, and beside her, she felt the slightest shift in his presence again, not a movement, not a gesture, but something that felt like acknowledgement, and for the first time since stepping into this world, Claire realized that she was not just being observed, she was being evaluated in real time, and that evaluation was already beginning to change, and as the room adjusted once more, the discussions taking on a different tone, less about whether she should be here and more about what her presence would mean, Claire Bennet understood that she had just crossed another invisible line, one that moved her from being a question into becoming part of the answer, even if she did not yet know what that answer would be. The room did not return to what it had been before, it could not, because something fundamental had shifted, not just in how they saw her, but in how they positioned themselves around her, and Claire felt it in the way the conversation no longer circled around her existence but began to move forward with it included, as if a decision had quietly solidified beneath the surface, and when the final voice spoke, older and steadier than the rest, acknowledging that what had been set in motion could not be undone without consequence, the words settled into the chamber like a closing door, and Claire understood that this was the moment everything became real, not in theory, not in possibility, but in structure, in expectation, in a future that was now being shaped in front of her, and as the meeting began to draw to a close, movements resumed with careful precision, chairs shifting, figures rising, each action controlled, deliberate, and she realized that even endings here were not chaotic. They were orchestrated, and as they stepped aside to allow him passage, their acknowledgement was no longer hesitant, it was measured, accepting, and that acceptance carried its own weight, because it meant she was no longer being questioned, she was being integrated, and that realization followed her as they left the chamber, the doors closing behind them with a quiet finality that seemed to echo longer than it should, and once again they found themselves in the corridor, the stillness returning, but now it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, as if something had been decided beyond reversal, and Claire walked beside him in silence, her thoughts moving through everything that had just happened, the questions, the reactions, the shift in tone when she had spoken, and she realized that each moment had built on the last, forming something she was only beginning to understand. And when they reached the same window overlooking the city, she paused without being told, her gaze drifting outward, the familiar streets now distant in a way that had nothing to do with physical space, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it fully, the distance between who she had been that morning and who she was becoming now, the waitress who counted tips in the back hallway and the woman standing here, part of a world that operated on entirely different rules, and the contrast should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt strangely clear, as if all the uncertainty had narrowed into a single undeniable truth, that her life had changed, completely, and that change was not temporary, not something that would fade once the night ended, it was permanent, and as that realization settled, she turned slightly, meeting his gaze again, not searching this time, not questioning, just acknowledging, and in that quiet exchange something passed between them, unspoken but understood, that whatever came next would not be simple, would not be easy, but it would be faced, together, and for the first time since this began, Claire Bennet did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something unknown, she felt like she had already stepped into it, and there was no going back, only forward, into a future that was already unfolding around her, and as the city lights flickered below and the night stretched on without pause, she understood one final truth that settled deep and steady in her chest. Even the coldest kings do not choose lightly, and whatever reason had led him to her, it was not something that would be undone, not now, not ever.